Today's spoiler video is brought to you by Card Kingdom. Use the link below to pre-order your cards today. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for our first daily dose of Ravnica Allegiance spoilers. So, really, we weren't expecting spoilers to start until January 2nd. That's the official start of spoilers, but we had some leaks, and then Wizards confirmed the leaks and announced that for this week, they're going to be showing off the mechanics from the set. So we have an early Christmas present with some super sweet Ravnica Allegiance spoilers, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So a quick reminder before we jump into our first dose of daily Ravnica Allegiance spoilers. If you enjoy this video and you haven't already, it would be so sweet of you if you could take a second, click that subscribe button down at the bottom of your screen. It's a great way to support the channel and the site for free. So let's talk some Ravnica Allegiance, starting with the one mythic that's been revealed so far, the Haunt of Hightower. So the Haunt of Hightower is the buy a box promo for Ravnica Allegiance. So you're not going to find it in actual boosters, but if you pick up a box from your local game store, you can get one of these cards as kind of a free bonus. So 6 mana, 3/3 with flying and lifelink, a legendary vampire, so it has some commander applications. Whenever it attacks, defending player discards a card, and then whenever a card is put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, you put a +1/+1 counter on the Haunt of Hightower. So this is a card that I feel is kind of the right power level for buy a box promos. I would be surprised to see Haunt of Hightower do anything in standard. However, it has some really sweet commander potential. So the most easy comparison for the Haunt of Hightower is kind of a legendary mono black version of Vulturous Zombie. Vulturous Zombie has the same basic mechanic. When a card goes in an opponent's graveyard for anywhere, you put a counter on it. This means if you can mill your opponent or even just cracking fetches, playing spells, Zombie grows pretty quickly, and the Haunt of Hightower is going to do the same exact thing, except you can also play it from your command zone, which is a nice upside to the Haunt of Hightower. As far as standard is concerned, on one hand, we do have a standard that is pretty focused on the graveyard. We have mechanics like Surveil, putting cards in the graveyard. Arclight Phoenix decks are all about casting a bunch of spells, getting Phoenixes in the graveyard. Stitcher Supplier and Golgari is kind of about the self-mill graveyard playing with Overgrowth. So there are a lot of decks that are looking to fill their graveyard. So you might think, okay, Haunt of Hightower could be a nice option there. You play it, your opponent casts Discovery, they Surveil a couple times, all of a sudden you get this huge flying lifelinker that can make your opponent discard a card. The problem is, the Haunt of Hightower doesn't do anything right away. If you read the card, it needs to attack to do anything. Your opponent needs cards to go in the graveyard to grow, which means when you cast it for 6 mana, you only have a 3/3, which is going to die to Lightning Strike, and Ravenous Chupacabra, and Ixalan's Binding, and pretty much anything else. So it's a card where if you can play it and it manages to survive, it can be potentially powerful. Get really big, gain you a bunch of life, but in our current format with so much powerful sorcery speed removal, it's going to be hard to imagine a 6 mana 3/3 that just does nothing right away is going to be worth playing in the format. So my guess for the Haunt of Hightower is it'll be a sweet commander card, people will play it in commander, it'll get huge and be really fun in commander, but you probably should look elsewhere for your standard threats, which is I think what we want from buy a box promos. We don't want them breaking standard like Nexus of Fate, being kind of okay and you can play them and really good in commander. That's probably about the right power level for a buy a box promo. So not a standard playable card necessarily, but a super sweet vampire nonetheless. Next on our list, oh my goodness, this card, Ravnica Allegiance Renegade, and this is one of the most powerful hate bearers we've seen in a long time. A 2 mana 2/2 in the Azorius colors, legendary human soldier, and it does two different things. Each opponent can't cast non-creature spells with converted mana cost greater than the number of lands that player controls. And whenever opponent casts a spell, if no mana was spent to cast it, you counter that spell. So Ravnica is a card where in standard, I don't really think it does a whole lot. I guess if someone breaks Omniscience, it's a nice hoser. You can play this, your opponent can't cast free things with Omniscience, so it's kind of a safety valve there. But this is one of those rare cards that actually gets more and more powerful the further back you go in formats. For example, let's talk about Modern. In Modern, you play a Ravnica, all of a sudden your Tron opponent can't just play 3 Tron lands and play a card Liberated. Hollow ones can no longer be cast for free, they'll get countered. It can even hose a deck like Storm, which wants to like play Brawl on turn 2, untap on turn 3, and win with 4 mana plays like Gifts Ungiven or Past in Flames. That doesn't work. Your opponent can't cast those because they won't have enough lands, so there's a lot of sweet fringe hate, and that doesn't even include all the other things it hates on. Like, you can't cast an Ornithopter. There's just so many weird fringe things that Ledvalia hates on. And if you go back even further, in Legacy, it's all about Force of Will. Like, 60% of decks are using the free counter spell. Once you get down the Hate Bear, your opponent can't force because it's a spell that's being cast with no mana. Lion's Eye Diamond from the Storm deck, Black Lotus in Vintage. So in older formats, this hits on a ton of different cards and is really, really powerful. And oddly, this card doesn't impact both players. Normally when you see a card like Gaddock Deeg, it's a symmetrical effect where, yes, you're doing something powerful, but you're kind of hosing yourself, or you got to build around it. Lavinia is all upside. It only affects your opponent, so you can still cast your Force of Will. You can still cast your Ornithopters, Hollow Ones, whatever you want to do, and let's not forget, it's a human. And humans is already one of the best tribes in the modern format. It's constantly getting more support, so maybe we'll see a more blue-white based human deck come to be. Maybe you don't need the crazy 5-color mana base that we see in modern humans. Maybe you could just be straight blue-white, or blue-white with a splash, and play your meddling mages, and lock your opponent out of the game, and Thalia's Lieutenant and Champion of the Parish. So there's already a natural home in modern for this card, and humans show up on occasion in Legacy as well. So I think Lavinia is a card that is kind of meh for Standard. I don't expect it to see a lot of play. It's a card that, if the right card is printed, maybe there's free spells coming, maybe there's some crazy artifact-based ramp coming, there could be a reason to play it in Standard, but for the most part, this is a card that can do a lot in Modern, in Legacy, in Vintage, in Commander, so I think this card is going to be very, very good in older formats, even if it doesn't necessarily have a home in Standard. Next on our list, we got one of my favorite cards that we've seen so far, Simic Ascendancy, our new You Win the Game card. So for 2 mana, you get an enchantment that lets you pay 3 mana, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, and then whenever you put 1 or more +1/+1 counters on a creature, you get to put that many growth counters on Simic Ascendancy. Finally, at the beginning of your upkeep, if it has 20 or more counters on it, you just win the game. So this is a card that I don't know if it's going to be competitive, but it's one of my favorite style of cards, where you have this quest, and you're trying to achieve this quest, and your reward is winning the game in a really non-traditional way. So as far as Standard, Simic Ascendancy, the easiest home for it, I think, is Merfolk. Merfolk are already close to being good, and they really care about +1/+1 counters. So you have like Kumana, Tyrant of Zaka, Deep Root Elite, Jade Light Ranger, there's so many +1/+1 counter synergies. If you could use something like Kumana and tap a bunch of Merfolk and put a +1/+1 counter on each Merfolk you control, let's say you got 5 Merfolk, that's going to be 5 counters, so you can actually get there pretty quickly if you just go wide with Merfolk. If you have 20 Merfolk, you tap Kumana, tap a bunch of Merfolk, all of a sudden you go from 0 counters to 20 counters all at once. Another possibility in Standard is something like the Hadana's Climb deck that we played on Budget Magic. You got Hadana's Climb putting counters on things. Creatures like Chamber Sentry, Belt Collector naturally get counters, so these are ways that you can slowly build up those growth counters. The only downside of Simic Ascendancy when it comes to being competitive is it's not really that efficient unless it is winning you the game. Paying 3 to put a single +1/+1 counter on something, even at instant speed, I guess I could kind of mess with combat, which is nice, but really, it's not very efficient compared to something like Hadana's Climb, which is giving you counters for free. So it's pretty slow on its own. So I think this is a card that you want to build as like your payoff, where you have all these Merfolk, you're tapping your Kumana, putting a bunch of counters on like 8 Merfolk at a time and just getting tons of counters. That's the direction to go with Simic Ascendancy. Also worth mentioning, it can do some pretty fun stuff in Commander. Jinara, Ashura of War, seems like a natural fit. You can just pay 1 and a white to put a counter on it. So if you could make 40 mana, or go infinite with mana, you can just keep adding counters, which also gets you growth counters to win the game. You could play it with Experimental Craj. One of my favorite cards isn't a Commander, but one of the easiest ways use to get those counters is Avenger Zendikar. If you can play Avenger Zendikar, with 10 lands, you're going to get 10 plant tokens, and then whenever you play a land, you get to put a counter on each plant. So if you play a fetch land, let's say, you get to put one counter on each of your 10 plants. That's 10 growth counters. Crack the fetch, get another land that's one counter on each of your plants again. That's up to 20 counters. So when Commander just a single Avenger of Zendikar and maybe an extra turn spell, so you don't got to wait around for your next turn and let everyone else get a shot to disrupt your plan, can just win you the game really, really quickly. So I think it has a lot of potential there. So I really love Simic Ascendancy. I don't think it's a card that's going to show up in tier decks in Standard unless we find some combo that allows it to happen really quickly. But it seems like a really fun semi-competitive card for against the odds style deck, budget magic style decks, and probably a really popular commander card as well. Next on our list, we have the reveal of the spectacle mechanic. So you probably saw Light Up the Stage a few days ago was leaked, and when we saw Light Up the Stage, we said, well, okay, this card could be really powerful if you can cast it for 1 mana consistently. So what is Spectacle? Spectacle is, you can cast the spell for its Spectacle cost as long as your opponent had lost life this turn. So you damage your opponent, they crack a fetch land, you lightning bolt their face. As long as your opponent has lost life in any way, you can cast the spell for its Spectacle cost instead of its normal cost. So here we have a few different examples. Rick's Maudry Reveler is a card that I actually really like. Light Up the Stage can be potentially super powerful. Rafter Demon, we're not going to talk about that one. It might be passable, filler, and limited, but that's about it. So Rick's Maudry Reveler, it's kind of like a Bedlam Reveler type effect for an aggro deck. The idea here is you have a 2 mana 2/2, but then you can Spectacle it for 2 black and red, so for 4 mana, and when it enters the battlefield, if you Spectacle it, you discard your hand and draw 3 cards. That is exactly the ability on Bedlam Reveler, except instead of wanting a spell slinger type deck, where you're looking to get a bunch of instants of sorceries in your graveyard, you can just play Rick's Maudry Reveler as the top end of your aggro deck, where you're playing a bunch of cheap red and black creatures, you're playing some bird spells, you get your hand close to empty, then for 4 mana you kind of just refill with this cheap draw 3 in red. The other upside of Rick's Maudry Reveler is it is a 2/2 for 2. So worst case, if you don't think you're going to empty your hand quickly or you need a blocker, you always can just run it out as a Grizzly Bear, which isn't exciting in Standard, but it's still fine. So I actually am pretty high on Rick's Maudry Reveler as the top end of an aggro Rakdos style deck. We'll have to see if we get support for that style of deck, if we get enough good Rakdos cards that we want to splash in our red aggro deck, but there's definitely potential here. If you can empty your hand over the first few turns of the game, for Rick's Maudry Reveler to offer a ton of value. And then our other Spectacle card is Light Up the Stage, which might be the single most powerful card revealed so far in the entire set. So 3 mana, you exile the top 2 cards of your library, and until your next turn you can play those cards, but you can Spectacle it for just 1. And the important thing about Light Up the Stage is the way it's worded, it says until the end of your next turn, not until the end of your current turn. So you can cast this, exile a couple of cards. If they're instants, you can cast them during your opponent's turn. If they are not instants, you can untap with all your mana and cast them the next turn. So we've seen similar effects like this. Act on Impulse kinda does it. Commune with Lava is kind of like that. But really, if you're in the right deck, like a burn deck, an aggro deck, this is essentially just a draw 2 for a single mana, which is incredibly powerful. That is a very good card advantage engine. So I'm excited to see what happens would Light Up the Stage. I think it can show up in red aggro in Standard, can possibly show up in other red X aggro decks, and might even have a chance in some modern decks. A deck like Burn, where you're just always lightning bolting your opponent's face anyway. Drawing 2 for a single mana is a pretty efficient deal. So I think Light Up the Stage, now that we know how Spectacle works and that it's pretty easy to trigger it in the right deck, I think this card is going to be very, very good and have potential even outside of Standard. Next on our list, we have Growth Spiral, a pretty innocent little common, green and a blue. You get to draw a card and put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield, and you could do this at instant speed. So Growth Spiral is basically Explore, except with some upside. So Explore is almost exactly the same card. You draw a card, you can make an extra land drop. It's worded slightly different, but the effect is essentially the same. You can play an extra land for your turn. The nice thing about Growth Spiral is you can cast it at instant speed, and even if you don't have a land to put into play, which you may or you may not, but you can cast it at the end of your opponent's turn after leaving up some interaction, a counter spell or something like that, and just cycle it for 2 mana, which is not the end of the world. And we've seen Explore be very strong. Explore was good in Standard with this last run, and it also shows up in Modern on occasion, in Primeval Titan type combo decks. So I think Growth Spiral is definitely a sleeper pick for the best common in the set, at least from what we've seen so far. We got a lot of commons to go, but this card is very, very good. Will probably show up in ramp decks in Standard, and could even show up in Modern as well. Finally, we get a bunch of commons and uncommons. Rakdos Firewheeler. I think this card could be good. It's another card that I think could be at the top end of an aggro deck. So the mana cost, it is intensive. Double black, double red, you get a 4/3. When it enters a battlefield, you can do 2 damage to an opponent and 2 damage to up to 1 target creature or planeswalker. So I feel like this is kind of a Ravenous Chupacabra, but more for aggro decks where you really want that 2 damage to your opponent's face. If you're curving out 1 drop, 2 drop, 3 drop, 4 drop, Rakdos Fireweaver coming down, being a shock on a body for your opponent's face, and maybe killing a blocker as well, that is a pretty good deal. So it's obviously restricted in where it can show up because of its mana cost, but I think this card could definitely be Standard playable. Mortify, reprint, a very good removal spell, especially in our current format. Destroying a creature or an enchantment for 3 mana instant speed is a nice upside, because right now in Standard, 2 really powerful cards are Search for Iskanta, which is an enchantment, and also Experimental Frenzy, another enchantment. So having your creature removal just randomly hose cards that can just straight up beat you, I have definitely lost many times to Frenzy and to Search for Iskanta, is a nice little upside compared to just killing a creature, because it makes Mortify relevant in matchups where otherwise it wouldn't be. Like against a creature-free Teferi control deck, your Murder isn't going to kill anything. It's very, very bad in your deck, but at least Mortify can do a little bit something before you sideboard it out for games 2 and 3. And finally, Gate Colossus. It's a fun limited payoff. Hopefully we get enough to make the Gates Matter deck work, at least as like a budget semi-competitive thing. Traditionally, the problem with Gate payoffs is you gotta play a lot of Gates, and Gates all enter the battlefield tapped. So I'm really hoping we get something like untaps Gates to speed up the deck a little bit. But really, I mean, if you could play 4 Gates, Gate Colossus is a 4 mana 8/8 with the ability to kind of be somewhat evasive and to come back from your graveyard as you play Gates. So you can make it fairly efficient and be a really big creature for its mana cost, and then of course you can live the dream of having a free 8/8, kind of like Metalwork Colossus style. So I don't know, we haven't seen enough yet to make me think that Gate Tribal can be a thing in Standard, but having another payoff certainly doesn't hurt. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Ravnica Allegiance spoilers for today. So let me know what you think about these crazy new cards. How good is the Haunt of Hightower? Is there any chance it could actually show up in Standard? What about Lavinia Azorius Renegade? Is this a card that's going to shake up Modern? Is it going to shake up Legacy? Does it have any other implications in Standard besides hosing the rare Omniscience deck you run into? How easy is it going to be to win the game with Simic Ascendancy? What are the best cards to enable it? What about all of the Spectacle cards? Is Rick's Body Reveler and Rafter Demon and Light Up the Stage going to help us have a new aggro deck in Standard going into Rakdos instead of Modern Red? All the random commons and uncommons, Growth Spiral, Gate Colossus, the Mortify reprint. Let me know what you think in the comments. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, help us out by clicking that like button down below. And to keep up on all the latest and greatest, click that subscribe button. And don't forget to hit that bell icon to get alerts whenever we have new videos. And if you want to, check out some of our other sweet videos here and here.